There are skills learned in silence that warfare cannot teach. In the autumn forests of Pennsylvania, a young man named Jacob Mercer spent 15 years tracking deer through fog and learning to read the language of branches. He never imagined that those mornings of patience, those calculations of wind and distance, would one day be repurposed to hunt men across the ruined landscapes of France. But in 1943, when the U.S. Army began searching for marksmen capable of countering the lethal efficiency of German snipers, Jacob's name appeared on a list compiled by his county's recruitment office. What followed was not a story of glory, but of transformation, of how a man who respected every kill in the woods learned to carry the weight of ending lives in a war that demanded precision without mercy. This is the account of how Jacob Mercer, a hunter from the Appalachian foothills, became one of the most effective counter-snipers on the Western Front, and how that efficiency slowly consumed the man who wielded it. Jacob Mercer was born in 1920 in a small town near the Allegheny National Forest, where hunting was not sport, but survival. His father, a logger, taught him to shoot at age 7 with a worn Winchester Model 70, a rifle that demanded respect for every cartridge. By the time Jacob turned 16, he could estimate distance by terrain shadow, adjust for crosswinds by watching pine needles, and remain motionless for hours in sub-zero cold. He hunted white-tailed deer and black bear, but his reputation came from his ability to track wounded game across miles of dense forest without losing the trail. Neighbors spoke of his patience, his refusal to take a shot unless it was clean, his insistence that every animal deserved a death without suffering. These were not the instincts of a soldier, they were the ethics of a woodsman who understood that killing carried responsibility. When the war began, Jacob tried to enlist twice and was rejected both times due to flat feet and a minor heart murmur. He continued working at his father's logging camp, frustrated by his inability to serve while friends shipped overseas. But in early 1943, the Army's need for sharpshooters became desperate. German snipers, trained in specialized schools and equipped with precision carabiner 98K rifles and Zeiss scopes, were decimating Allied officers and forward observers. Standard infantry training produced soldiers who could shoot at targets, but not hunters who could think like prey and predator simultaneously. The War Department issued a directive: find men who grew up with rifles, men who understood fieldcraft, men who could outweight an enemy in conditions where a single mistake meant death. Jacob's name reached a recruitment officer through a local game warden who had seen him shoot. In April 1943, Jacob received a telegram ordering him to report for specialized training at Camp Perry, Ohio. He was 23 years old. His mother cried when he left, not because she feared he would die, but because she knew what hunting men would do to someone who had spent his life respecting the sanctity of the kill. His father said nothing, only handed him a small leather journal and told him to write down everything he saw. Jacob never wrote a single word in that journal. He kept it in his coat pocket through the entire war, blank pages growing soft with sweat and rain, a record of silence. The training at Camp Perry was unlike anything Jacob had experienced. The other recruits came from rural backgrounds similar to his: trappers from Montana, deer hunters from Wisconsin, turkey callers from Tennessee. But the instructors were different. They were men who had studied German sniper tactics, who understood that this was not about marksmanship alone, but about psychological warfare. The Germans used snipers to create fear, to make every movement dangerous, to force entire units into paralysis. The counter-sniper's job was to break that fear by eliminating the threat, often without the enemy ever knowing they were being hunted. Jacob learned to read muzzle flash in daylight, to distinguish the crack of a Mauser from a Kar 98K by sound alone, to construct hides using rubble and foliage that blended so perfectly that German spotters would scan past him a dozen times. He learned to kill quickly, cleanly, and without hesitation. The instructors told him that hesitation in this work meant death, not just his own, but that of the men he was sent to protect. What disturbed Jacob most during training was the shift in language. In the woods, he had always thought of his targets as animals deserving respect. Here, the instructors referred to enemy snipers as problems, threats, or simply targets. There was no room for the hunter's code, no space for the ethics Jacob had carried since childhood. One evening, after a particularly brutal lecture on psychological tactics, how to leave a body visible to demoralize enemy units, how to wound rather than kill to draw out other snipers, Jacob asked his instructor if there was any way to do this work without losing the part of himself that believed killing should be clean. The instructor, a man named Sergeant Hale who had fought in North Africa, looked at him for a long time before answering. "You can do this work and stay whole," Hale said quietly, "or you can do this work and stay alive. But Mercer, you will not do both." Jacob never asked another question. By June 1943, Jacob completed training and was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, preparing for deployment to England ahead of the invasion of Normandy. He was issued a Springfield M1903A4 rifle with a Weaver 330C scope, a weapon he found heavier and less intuitive than his Winchester, but devastatingly accurate at ranges beyond 500 yards. He was also given a spotter, a young man from Ohio named Paul Dietrich, whose job was to assist with target identification and range estimation. Paul was 20 years old, talkative, and terrified. Jacob liked him immediately because Paul reminded him of his younger brother, who had died of pneumonia at age 12. They spent the crossing to England in near silence, Paul trying to start conversations about home, and Jacob staring at the grey water, already feeling the weight of what was coming. The transport ship carrying Jacob's unit docked in Liverpool in early July. From there, they were moved to a staging area in southern England, where the scale of the coming invasion became clear. Thousands of men, endless rows of equipment, the constant roar of aircraft overhead. Jacob felt small in a way he never had in the Pennsylvania forests. In the woods, he had always known where he stood, always understood his role in the natural order. Here, he was a single instrument in a machine designed for industrial-scale killing. He wrote a letter to his mother that he never sent, trying to explain that he was no longer the son who had left home, that something fundamental had shifted. He tore the letter up and scattered it in a ditch, watching the pieces dissolve in the rain. In late July, Jacob's unit received orders to prepare for deployment to France. The invasion of Normandy had succeeded, but the advance inland was grinding to a halt in the hedgerow country of Normandy, where German snipers turned every field and farmhouse into a killing zone. Allied casualties from sniper fire were climbing, and the demand for counter-snipers had become urgent. Jacob was told he would be inserted into forward positions within days of landing, tasked with eliminating high-value targets and breaking enemy sniper networks. He cleaned his rifle that night with the same care he had once used to clean his Winchester after a successful hunt, but his hands shook in a way they never had before. Paul noticed and asked if he was afraid. Jacob told him no, which was true. He was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of becoming very good at this. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested to know to which places and at which moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. Jacob Mercer landed in France on August 3, 1944, stepping off a landing craft onto Omaha Beach 2 months after the initial invasion. The sand was still stained with rust-colored patches, and scattered equipment, helmets, ammo crates, fragments of webbing, lay half-buried like archaeological evidence of recent catastrophe. The beach was quiet now, but the air carried a chemical smell Jacob could not identify, something metallic and wrong that made his throat tighten. Paul vomited twice during the march inland, not from fear but from the odor of decomposition that clung to the hedgerows lining every road. Jacob said nothing, focusing instead on the terrain, already cataloguing sight lines and cover, already thinking like a hunter in a landscape designed for ambush. Their unit was attached to the 29th Infantry Division, which had suffered devastating casualties during the initial landings, and was now pushing slowly through the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, where every field was bordered by thick earthen walls, topped with centuries-old bramble and trees. The bocage was a nightmare for attackers and a paradise for defenders. German troops could observe advancing Americans from hidden positions, pour fire into narrow lanes, and retreat through gaps in the hedgerows before artillery could respond. But it was the snipers who caused the most psychological damage. A single German marksman could pin down an entire company, forcing men to crawl through mud for hours, never knowing if the next movement would be their last. Officers were targeted first, then radio operators, then medics. The goal was not just to kill, but to paralyze, to make command impossible and courage meaningless. Jacob was briefed by a captain named Riverside, a thin man with a facial tic who had lost 3 officers to sniper fire in the past week. Riverside spoke in clipped sentences, his eyes unfocused, and Jacob realized the man was on the edge of collapse. "We need you to find them," Riverside said, his voice flat. "We need you to kill them. We need you to do it quickly, and we need you to do it quietly, because every day we sit here, we lose more men." He handed Jacob a folder containing intelligence reports on suspected sniper positions, German tactics, and photographs of enemy equipment recovered from dead marksmen. The photographs showed carabiner 98K rifles with high-quality optics, camouflage smocks made from burlap and netting, and, most disturbing, small leather-bound notebooks filled with handwritten tallies. The Germans were keeping score. Jacob's first assignment was to locate and eliminate a sniper known to Allied forces as the Crow, a nickname given because survivors reported hearing a cawing sound before shots were fired. The Crow operated in a sector near the village of St. Lo, where American forces were attempting to break through German defensive lines. In the past 5 days, the Crow had killed 11 men, including 2 lieutenants and a medic. The pattern suggested a single marksman with exceptional patience and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Jacob studied the reports, noting the times of attacks, always early morning or late afternoon when shadows were long, and the positions of victims, which suggested the shooter was firing from elevated positions within the hedgerows themselves, possibly from trees or concealed platforms. Jacob and Paul moved into position before dawn on August 6th, carrying minimal equipment to reduce noise. They entered the sector from the east, using a drainage ditch to avoid skyline exposure, and settled into a hide Jacob constructed using a destroyed farmhouse foundation and natural vegetation. The hide was designed not to be invisible, but to blend so thoroughly with the surrounding rubble that even trained eyes would scan past it multiple times. Paul set up the spotting scope, while Jacob controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate, entering the state of hyper-awareness he had learned in the Pennsylvania forests. They waited. Hours passed. The sun rose, casting harsh light across the fields. Nothing moved. At 10:47 a.m., Paul whispered a single word: movement. Jacob shifted his eye to the scope, scanning the hedgerow 200 yards northeast. For several seconds, he saw nothing. Then a shape, barely perceptible, a geometric anomaly among organic forms. It was a platform woven from branches and burlap, positioned 15 feet up in an oak tree. The construction was masterful, using the tree's natural shadow and the density of leaves to create a hide that would be invisible from ground level. Jacob watched for another 3 minutes, waiting for confirmation. Then he saw it, the faint glint of a scope lens catching sunlight for less than a second, followed by the slow movement of a rifle barrel adjusting position. Jacob calculated range, wind, and elevation. The distance was 220 yards, well within the effective range of his Springfield, but the angle was problematic. He would be shooting upward through foliage, and any deflection could send the round off target. He adjusted his position slightly, bracing the rifle against a chunk of concrete, and waited for the German sniper to commit to a shot. The wait lasted 17 minutes. Jacob's finger rested on the trigger guard, his breathing synchronized with Paul's whispered observations. Then the German shifted, a small movement, preparing to fire at an American patrol moving through the adjacent field. Jacob saw the barrel extend slightly beyond the hide's edge, saw the scope lens flash again, and fired. The sound of the Springfield was enormous in the morning quiet, a crack that echoed across the bocage and sent birds exploding from the trees. Jacob did not wait to confirm the hit. He was already moving, Paul scrambling behind him, both men retreating through the drainage ditch as German machine gun fire tore through the position they had occupied seconds before. They ran in a controlled crouch for 200 yards, then dropped into a shell crater and waited. After 10 minutes, the firing stopped. After 20 minutes, they heard shouting in German, frantic and disorganized. After 30 minutes, an American patrol reported that the sniper known as the Crow had been found dead in a tree hide, killed by a single shot to the upper chest that had severed the subclavian artery. The sniper's notebook, recovered from the body, contained 43 tally marks. That night, Jacob sat in a ruined barn with Paul, cleaning his rifle by candlelight. Paul was excited, talking rapidly about the shot, about how precise it had been, about how many lives Jacob had saved. Jacob nodded, but said nothing. He was thinking about the German sniper's notebook, about the 43 marks, about the fact that the man had been keeping score, just as the instructors at Camp Perry had taught them to do. He was thinking about how easy the shot had felt, how natural, how his body had executed the kill with the same efficiency he had once used to drop a deer at 300 yards. He was thinking about Sergeant Hale's words, "You can do this work and stay whole, or you can do this work and stay alive, but you will not do both." Jacob realized, sitting in that barn with gunpowder residue still on his hands, that he had already made his choice. Over the next 3 weeks, Jacob eliminated 6 more enemy snipers across the Normandy sector. Each kill followed the same pattern: meticulous reconnaissance, patient observation, a single shot, immediate withdrawal. He developed a reputation among the infantry units he supported, and men began requesting him by name when sniper activity increased. Officers praised his efficiency. Paul began keeping an informal tally, which Jacob asked him to stop. But the kills continued, and with each one, Jacob felt something inside himself calcifying, hardening into a tool that functioned without questioning. He stopped writing letters home. He stopped making small talk with other soldiers. He ate, slept, and hunted, and the boundaries between those activities began to blur. In late August, Jacob's unit was pulled back for a brief rest period before the advance toward Paris. During the rest, Jacob was summoned to a meeting with a colonel named Vance, who ran intelligence operations for the division. Vance was interested in Jacob's methods, particularly his ability to locate enemy snipers who had evaded detection for weeks. Jacob explained his process, reading terrain for advantageous positions, understanding the psychology of patient shooters, recognizing patterns in attack timing. Vance listened carefully, then asked a question that made Jacob's stomach tighten. "Mercer, do you think you could train others to do what you do?" Jacob wanted to say no, wanted to explain that what he did was not teachable because it required erasing parts of yourself that most men should never lose. Instead, he said yes, because that was what soldiers did. They said yes, and they adapted, and they survived. The American advance toward Paris accelerated in late August, and with it came a shift in the nature of Jacob's work. The bocage fighting had been brutal but contained, a slow, grinding war of attrition where every field and hedgerow was contested. Now, as Allied forces pushed eastward and German units began retreating toward defensive lines, the battlefield became fluid and chaotic. Sniper activity evolved from static ambushes to mobile harassment, with German marksmen firing from second-story windows, church steeples, and abandoned vehicles before melting into civilian populations or retreating columns. Jacob's role expanded from eliminating individual threats to dismantling entire sniper teams, a task that required not just marksmanship, but tactical thinking and a willingness to operate behind enemy lines. On September 2nd, Jacob and Paul were inserted into the outskirts of a town called Mezidon Cannon, 30 miles from the Norman coast, where intelligence reported a German sniper team operating with unusual sophistication. This was not a lone marksman, but a coordinated cell, a primary shooter, a spotter, and at least one additional rifleman providing security. The team had killed 14 American soldiers in 3 days, targeting radio operators and forward observers with a precision that suggested professional military training rather than improvised defense. What made the threat particularly dangerous was their mobility. They never fired from the same position twice, and they seemed to anticipate American patrol routes with uncanny accuracy. Jacob studied the pattern of attacks and realized the German team was using the town's architecture strategically. Mezidon Cannon was built around a central square with narrow side streets radiating outward, creating multiple elevated firing positions with overlapping fields of view. The Germans would fire from one location, then move through buildings using interior passages and rooftops, repositioning before Allied forces could respond with artillery or air support. It was a tactic that required intimate knowledge of the urban terrain, suggesting the team had either been stationed in the town before the retreat or included local collaborators. Jacob decided the only way to counter them was to enter the town covertly, establish overwatch on the square, and wait for the Germans to commit to an attack. Jacob and Paul infiltrated Mezidon Cannon at 3:01 a.m. on September 3rd, moving through the rubble-strewn eastern approach under a moonless sky. The town was eerily quiet, its civilian population evacuated or hiding, its streets littered with the debris of recent combat. They chose a 3-story residential building overlooking the square, accessing it through a collapsed wall on the ground floor. Inside, the structure was gutted, furniture overturned, walls pocked with shrapnel, staircases half-collapsed. Jacob tested each step for stability, moving with the same deliberate silence he had used stalking deer through frozen Pennsylvania forests. They reached the 3rd floor and positioned themselves near a window with a clear view of the square and adjacent rooftops. The wait began. Jacob had learned that patience was the ultimate weapon in this kind of warfare, that the side willing to endure longer stretches of motionless observation almost always prevailed. Hours passed. The sun rose, casting harsh light across the square. An American patrol moved through at 7:15 a.m., cautious and slow, rifles raised. Nothing happened. The patrol withdrew. At 9:30 a.m., another patrol entered from the west. This time, Jacob saw movement, a shadow shifting in a window across the square, too deliberate to be wind or debris. He tracked it with his scope, waiting. The shadow became a shape, then a rifle barrel, then a figure in German camouflage settling into a firing position. Jacob whispered to Paul, "2nd story, northwest building, center window." Paul confirmed through the spotting scope, adding details. The shooter was alone, no visible spotter, setting up for a shot at the American patrol now exposed in the square. Jacob calculated distance, 175 yards, minimal wind, clear shot. But something felt wrong. The German sniper was too visible, too careless for someone who had evaded detection for days. Jacob held his fire, scanning adjacent buildings. Then he saw it. Another figure, barely visible, positioned in a bell tower 2 buildings north. The spotter, and likely a second shooter somewhere close, forming a triangle of interlocking fire designed to trap anyone who engaged the primary target. Jacob made a decision. He would fire at the sniper in the window, knowing it would expose his position, then immediately shift to target the spotter in the bell tower, while Paul provided suppressive fire toward likely secondary positions. It was aggressive, risky, and violated every principle of counter-sniper doctrine he had been taught. But the alternative, allowing the German team to kill more Americans, was unacceptable. Jacob steadied his breathing, aligned his crosshairs on the German sniper's upper torso, and fired. The Springfield's report shattered the morning silence. The German sniper jerked backward, the rifle clattering from the window. Jacob was already cycling the bolt, swinging his scope toward the bell tower. The spotter was moving, bringing up his own rifle, searching for Jacob's position. Jacob fired again. The round struck the stone ledge inches from the spotter's head, forcing him to duck. Paul opened fire with his M1 Garand, raking the building below the bell tower, suppressing potential threats. For 30 seconds, the square erupted in gunfire, German machine guns from unseen positions, American return fire from the patrol below, the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the streets. Then silence. Jacob and Paul remained frozen, scanning for threats. Slowly, the American patrol advanced, clearing the buildings where the Germans had operated. They found the primary sniper dead, killed by Jacob's first shot. The spotter in the bell tower had fled, leaving behind a Carabiner 98K and a map marked with patrol routes, intelligence that had allowed the German team to anticipate American movements. No secondary shooter was found, suggesting Jacob's instinct had been correct, but that the third team member had escaped. The patrol leader, a sergeant named Kowalski, radioed Jacob's position and requested they remain in overwatch for the rest of the day in case the Germans returned. Jacob and Paul stayed in that gutted building for 14 hours, watching the square, waiting for movement that never came. During that time, Paul talked about home, about the farm his family owned in Ohio, about plans to study engineering after the war. Jacob listened, but did not respond. He was thinking about the German spotter's map, about the level of planning required to create it, about the fact that the enemy snipers were not mindless killers, but professionals doing the same work he was, trying to survive the same war. He wondered if the spotter he had missed was thinking the same things, holed up somewhere in the town, waiting for darkness to retreat. That night, as they withdrew from Mezidon Cannon, Paul asked Jacob how many enemy snipers he thought were still operating in the region. Jacob said he did not know, which was true, but what he did not say was that the number no longer mattered to him. Each kill had become mechanical, a problem solved, a threat neutralized. He no longer thought of them as men with families and fears. They were targets, and he was a tool designed to eliminate targets. Sergeant Hale had been right. There was no staying whole in this work. There was only efficiency and survival, and the slow erosion of everything that had made him human in the Pennsylvania forests. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. By mid-September 1944, Jacob Mercer had killed 23 enemy snipers across the French countryside, a tally he kept only because Paul insisted on recording it in a small notebook that mirrored the German practice Jacob found so disturbing. Each entry was clinical: date, location, estimated range, outcome. Paul treated the notebook like a ledger of accomplishment, proof of their effectiveness. Jacob viewed it as evidence of something irretrievable slipping away. He never asked Paul to stop recording, because doing so would require acknowledging that the numbers mattered, that each kill had accumulated into a weight he could no longer ignore. Instead, he focused on the work, allowing the rhythm of reconnaissance, patience, and precision to fill the spaces where introspection once lived. The liberation of Paris brought temporary reprieve. Jacob's unit was pulled back for rest and resupply, while Allied forces consolidated control of the capital and prepared for the advance into Belgium and Germany. For 5 days, Jacob and Paul stayed in a requisitioned hotel on the city's outskirts, where hot water and clean sheets felt like artifacts from a previous life. Paul spent his time exploring the city, trying to practice his broken French with locals and writing long letters to his family. Jacob remained in his room, disassembling and cleaning his rifle repeatedly, a meditative process that required no thought and produced no memories. On the third night, Paul brought a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, insisting they celebrate their survival. Jacob drank mechanically, tasting nothing, and when Paul asked if he was all right, Jacob lied and said yes. On September 19th, orders arrived. Jacob's unit was being reassigned to the 2nd Armored Division for the push into Belgium, where German forces were establishing defensive positions along the Siegfried Line. Intelligence indicated that Wehrmacht sniper schools had accelerated training programs, flooding the Western Front with marksmen tasked with slowing the Allied advance through asymmetric warfare. The new generation of German snipers was younger, less experienced but more fanatical, willing to hold positions until death rather than retreat. They operated in urban environments, Aachen, Metz, Strasbourg, where every building became a potential sniper nest and civilian casualties were inevitable. Jacob's role would shift again, from eliminating individual threats in rural terrain to conducting urban counter-sniper operations in cities where the line between combatant and non-combatant had dissolved. The first engagement came in early October outside the Belgian city of Aachen, a critical industrial center straddling the German border. American forces faced brutal resistance as they attempted to encircle the city, with German defenders turning apartment blocks and factories into fortified positions. Sniper fire was constant, indiscriminate, targeting anyone who moved through open streets. Jacob and Paul were attached to an infantry company tasked with clearing a residential district on the city's western edge, a maze of 3-story buildings connected by courtyards and alleyways. The district had been evacuated weeks earlier, but scattered civilians remained, elderly residents too frail to flee, families hiding in basements, children separated from parents in the chaos of retreat. Jacob established an observation post on the 4th floor of a partially collapsed apartment building, giving him overwatch on 6 blocks of the district. The destruction was total, walls blown open to expose domestic interiors, streets cratered by artillery, smoke rising from fires that burned unchecked. Through his scope, Jacob watched American infantry advance building by building, using explosive charges to breach walls and grenades to clear rooms. The pace was agonizingly slow, and every 50 yards gained came at the cost of casualties from well-concealed snipers who fired from rubble piles, through drainage grates, from positions so unconventional that standard suppression tactics were useless. Over 3 days, Jacob identified and eliminated 8 enemy snipers in the district, but the kills felt different from those in rural France. In the bocage, targets had been soldiers in clearly defined positions. Here, the boundaries blurred. Jacob killed a 16-year-old Hitlerjugend member, firing from a burned-out tram, his uniform too large and his hands shaking so badly Jacob could see it through the scope. He killed an older man, likely a local conscript, positioned in a church basement with a hunting rifle that predated the war. He killed a woman in her 20s, wearing civilian clothes over a Wehrmacht uniform, firing from a window in an apartment where children's toys were scattered across the floor. Each shot was clean, precise, necessary. Each shot required Jacob to ignore context, to see only threat and solution. On October 8th, Jacob received intelligence about a German sniper operating in the district with exceptional skill, someone the infantry had nicknamed the Watchmaker because his shots were timed with mechanical precision, always during brief windows when Allied forces were most exposed, always targeting individuals whose deaths would cause maximum disruption. The Watchmaker had killed 19 men in 6 days, including 3 officers and a combat medic attempting to reach wounded soldiers. His positions were never reused, and he seemed to predict American movements with an accuracy that suggested inside knowledge or extraordinary tactical intuition. Jacob studied the pattern of attacks and concluded the Watchmaker was using the city's industrial infrastructure, water towers, factory catwalks, crane platforms, to gain elevation and mobility that ground-level hides could not provide. Jacob decided to hunt the Watchmaker using a tactic he had employed only once before, becoming bait. He coordinated with the infantry company to stage a false casualty scenario, where a soldier would simulate being wounded in an open courtyard while medics prepared to respond. The goal was to draw the Watchmaker into a premature shot, revealing his position long enough for Jacob to counter-fire. It was dangerous, relying on the Watchmaker's predictability and Jacob's reaction speed, but conventional observation had failed. The operation was scheduled for dawn on October 9th, when low light would force the Watchmaker to expose more of himself to confirmed targets. At 6:15 a.m., the operation began. A private named Ellis lay in the courtyard simulating injury, while two medics positioned nearby prepared to move. Jacob watched from a concealed position 200 yards south, his scope trained on the industrial structures surrounding the courtyard. Minutes passed. The courtyard remained still. Then, at 6:22 a.m., Jacob saw it, a shape moving on a water tower platform 300 yards northwest, adjusting position to gain a clear shot at the medics. Jacob tracked the movement, waiting for confirmation. The shape became a figure, became a rifle, became a face pressed against a scope. Jacob fired. The round struck the Watchmaker in the side, a non-fatal hit that sent him sprawling across the platform. Jacob fired again, and the second shot connected with the target's upper chest. The figure went still. American forces moved to secure the tower, finding a German corporal named Klaus Dietrich, aged 24, a trained sniper from the Arnhem area who had been defending Aachen for 3 weeks. In his pack was a journal containing detailed notes on American tactics, sketches of building layouts, and a letter to his wife, describing his fear that he would not survive the war. Jacob read the letter later that day, sitting in the ruins of a bakery, and realized that Klaus Dietrich had been exactly like him, a skilled hunter forced into a role that required killing men with the same efficiency he might have once used hunting game. The only difference was the flag they served. That night, Jacob told Paul he no longer wanted the notebook updated. Paul protested, arguing that the record was important, that people needed to know what they had accomplished. Jacob said the record did not matter, that numbers could not capture what this work cost, that every entry was a life erased and a piece of himself destroyed. Paul looked at him with concern and said, maybe Jacob should talk to the chaplain, that maybe he was carrying too much. Jacob said he was fine, another lie, and returned to cleaning his rifle. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the darkness, listening to artillery rumble in the distance, and wondered if Klaus Dietrich's wife would ever learn how her husband died, if she would understand that the man who killed him felt nothing but emptiness. The advance into Germany began in late October, and with it came a shift in the psychological weight of the war. Fighting in France and Belgium had been liberation. Crossing into German territory felt like intrusion, a descent into the heart of machinery that had consumed Europe. The landscape changed. Fields gave way to industrial towns, forests to mining operations, farmhouses to workers' housing built in rigid rows. The German population, what remained of it, watched American forces with expressions that ranged from defiance to resignation. Jacob found the silence of German villages more disturbing than combat, the way civilians stood in doorways and stared without speaking, as if bearing witness to something inevitable and catastrophic. Jacob's unit pushed toward the Rhine, participating in operations to reduce German defensive positions along the river's western approaches. The fighting intensified as Wehrmacht and SS units conducted desperate rearguard actions, attempting to buy time for fortifications to be completed. Sniper activity reached levels Jacob had not experienced since Normandy, with German marksmen operating from cellars, rooftops and tunnels in coordinated networks designed to channel American forces into kill zones. The stakes had changed. These were no longer defensive snipers protecting retreat routes. These were soldiers fighting for their homeland, willing to die in place rather than surrender ground. In early November, Jacob was tasked with eliminating a sniper network operating in the town of Duran, a strategic position controlling river crossings into the Rhineland. Intelligence indicated at least 5 highly trained snipers were coordinating attacks from positions throughout the town using a communication system, possibly field telephones or runners, to share information and adjust tactics in real time. American casualties were mounting, and the advance had stalled. Jacob was given operational freedom. He could take as much time as needed, use any resources available, and operate with minimal oversight. The message was clear. This network had to be destroyed, regardless of cost. Jacob and Paul spent 2 days conducting reconnaissance from positions outside Duran, observing patterns, identifying likely hide locations, and mapping the town's infrastructure. Jacob noticed something unusual. The German snipers were rotating positions on a schedule, never staying in one location for more than 2 hours. This suggested discipline, training, and leadership, the hallmarks of a Scharfschützen unit, specialized sniper teams that had emerged from German military academies in the war's later years. These were not improvised marksmen, but professional soldiers whose entire focus was asymmetric warfare. Defeating them would require more than patience. It would require thinking like they thought, understanding their doctrine, and exploiting the one weakness all structured systems possessed: predictability. Jacob developed a plan. Rather than engage the snipers directly, he would disrupt their communication network, forcing them to operate independently and breaking the coordination that made them effective. He identified 3 potential communication hubs: a partially destroyed post office, a church basement, and an underground bunker near the town's center. If he could eliminate the personnel manning those hubs or destroy the equipment, the network would fragment, and individual snipers could be hunted conventionally. The plan required moving through Duran during active combat, bypassing German defensive positions, and conducting sabotage operations in enemy-controlled territory. It was far beyond the scope of counter-sniper work, closer to commando operations, and carried a high probability of death or capture. Paul objected immediately, arguing that the mission was suicidal, that they were marksmen, not saboteurs, that command would never authorize such a plan. Jacob said he was not asking for authorization. Paul stared at him, understanding for the first time that something fundamental had broken in his partner, that the man who had once been a careful hunter was now a weapon that recognized only objectives and obstacles. Paul said he would not participate, that he would report the plan if Jacob attempted it. Jacob nodded and told Paul to get reassigned, that he would complete the mission alone. They did not speak for the rest of the day. That night, Jacob infiltrated Duran alone, carrying his Springfield rifle, a silenced M1911 pistol, and 4 demolition charges. He moved through the town using drainage systems and collapsed buildings, avoiding main streets where German patrols operated. His first target was the church basement, where he observed 2 soldiers manning a field telephone. Jacob watched from a ruined adjacent structure for 20 minutes, confirming their routine, then approached using the building's foundation as cover. He killed both soldiers with the pistol, 2 shots, close range, instantaneous. He placed a demolition charge on the telephone switchboard and withdrew, detonating the charge remotely from 2 blocks away. The explosion brought German troops running, creating chaos and drawing attention away from his next objectives. Over the next 6 hours, Jacob systematically destroyed the remaining communication hubs, killing 8 German soldiers in the process. Each encounter was brief, efficient, emotionless. He moved through Duran like a ghost, appearing long enough to eliminate a target or destroy equipment before vanishing into rubble. By dawn, the sniper network's coordination had collapsed, and individual marksmen were forced to operate without intelligence or support. American forces, sensing the shift, pressed their advance, clearing buildings with renewed aggression. By noon on November 6th, Duran was secured, and the German sniper network was effectively destroyed. Jacob returned to American lines exhausted, covered in dust and smoke residue, his hands trembling from adrenaline depletion. Paul was waiting, expression unreadable. He said nothing, only handed Jacob a canteen and walked away. Later that day, Jacob was summoned to meet with Colonel Vance, who had learned about the unauthorized operation through field reports. Vance was furious, calling the mission reckless and insubordinate, threatening court-martial proceedings. But before he could finish, another officer interrupted with a casualty report. American losses in Duran had dropped by 70% after the communication hubs were destroyed, and the town had been secured days ahead of schedule. Vance stared at Jacob for a long time, then dismissed him without further comment. That night, Jacob sat alone in a ruined farmhouse, staring at his rifle. He had killed 39 enemy soldiers since landing in France, a number that meant nothing and everything. He thought about Klaus Dietrich's letter, about the 16-year-old in Aachen, about the soldiers manning the telephone in Duran's church basement who died before they could turn around. He thought about Sergeant Hale's warning at Camp Perry, about his father's blank journal, about the Pennsylvania forests where killing had once been sacred. He realized he had become precisely what the war required. A man who could end lives without hesitation, guilt, or memory. The transformation was complete. Jacob Mercer, the hunter who respected every kill, no longer existed. What remained was a weapon that functioned until it was no longer needed. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but for Jacob Mercer, the conflict continued in silence. He remained with his unit through the occupation, stationed in a requisitioned German town near Stuttgart, where American forces supervised the transition from Nazi administration to Allied control. The days were filled with bureaucratic tasks, securing weapons caches, interrogating former Wehrmacht officers, managing displaced persons camps. Jacob was assigned to training duties, teaching counter-sniper tactics to soldiers preparing for potential deployment to the Pacific Theater. He taught mechanically, demonstrating fieldcraft and marksmanship with the same efficiency he had applied to killing, but he never answered questions about what the work felt like, about how to carry it afterward. Paul Dietrich was discharged in June and returned to Ohio, where he resumed studies at his family's farm. Before leaving, he gave Jacob the notebook containing the tally of their kills, 39 confirmed eliminations over 9 months of operations. Paul said Jacob should keep it as a record of what they had accomplished, proof that their work had saved lives. Jacob accepted the notebook and burned it that same night, watching the pages curl and blacken in a trash barrel behind his barracks. He never contacted Paul again, despite receiving 3 letters over the following year. The friendship, like so much else, had been a casualty of the work they had performed together. In August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan's surrender, Jacob received orders for discharge. He was awarded the Silver Star for actions in Duran, a commendation he accepted without comment and placed in his footlocker without ceremony. His commanding officer asked if he planned to continue military service, noting that the Army needed experienced instructors for sniper programs. Jacob declined. The officer asked what he would do as a civilian. Jacob said he would return to Pennsylvania and resume logging. The officer looked skeptical but did not press further. Jacob arrived home in September 1945, stepping off a bus in the same town he had left 2 years earlier. His mother wept when she saw him, holding him for long minutes while his father stood silently, eyes searching Jacob's face for evidence of the son who had departed. Jacob said little during those first weeks, spending his days helping at the logging camp and his evenings sitting on the porch, watching the forest edge. His mother asked repeatedly if he was all right, if he needed anything, if he wanted to talk. Jacob said he was fine. The same lie he had told Paul in Aachen, in Paris, in every moment when the weight of what he had done threatened to overwhelm him. His father gave him back the blank journal, the one Jacob had carried through France and Germany without writing a single word. His father said he understood why the pages were empty, that some experiences existed beyond language, but that Jacob should keep it anyway, as a reminder that silence was also a form of testimony. Jacob placed the journal on a shelf in his childhood room, where it remained for decades, pages yellowing but still blank, a monument to everything that could not be spoken. Jacob tried to return to hunting that first autumn, taking his old Winchester into the forests where he had learned to track and shoot. He located a 12-point buck within an hour, a magnificent animal moving through morning fog, and lined up a shot at 200 yards, the same distance he had fired in Duran, in Mezidon cannon, in countless engagements where targets were men instead of deer. His finger rested on the trigger. The buck paused, broadside, perfect presentation. Jacob held the position for 5 minutes, then slowly lowered the rifle. He could not pull the trigger. The calculation was identical: wind, distance, breathing, but the weight was unbearable. He saw Klaus Dietrich's face, the 16-year-old in Aachen, the soldiers in the church basement. He saw all 39 men he had killed, and he understood that the hunter's code he had carried since childhood had been destroyed so completely that even this, the act that had once defined him, was now impossible. Jacob walked out of the forest and never hunted again. Over the following years, Jacob worked at his father's logging camp, eventually taking over operations when his father's health declined. He married a woman named Catherine in 1948, a school teacher who asked few questions about the war and accepted his long silences without complaint. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, whom Jacob raised with quiet affection but emotional distance. He taught them to respect the forest, to understand the responsibility of taking life, but he never taught them to shoot. When his son asked why, Jacob said some skills were better left unlearned. Catherine understood, though Jacob never explained, and she never pressed. Jacob's reputation as a counter-sniper remained largely unknown in his community. The men who had served with him were scattered across the country, and Jacob made no effort to maintain contact. He attended no veteran reunions, joined no service organizations, and spoke of the war only when directly asked. And even then, his answers were brief and technical, devoid of emotion or narrative. Neighbors who knew he had served assumed he had been a standard infantryman. Only his father knew the truth, having read the commendation that accompanied the Silver Star, and his father never spoke of it to anyone. In 1963, a journalist researching American sniper operations during World War II located Jacob through military records and requested an interview. The journalist had spoken with other counter-snipers who described Jacob as one of the most effective marksmen on the Western Front, and he wanted to document Jacob's methods and experiences for a book about specialized warfare. Jacob refused the interview. The journalist persisted, writing letters and eventually visiting Jacob's home unannounced. Jacob met him on the porch and said quietly that there was nothing to discuss, that the work he had done was over, and that documenting it would serve no purpose. The journalist argued that the story was important, that people needed to understand the skill and sacrifice of men like Jacob. Jacob responded that the only thing people needed to understand was that war turned hunters into killers, and that some men never recovered from the transformation. The journalist left and never contacted him again. Jacob's children grew and left home. His wife passed away in 1982, and his father died the following year. Jacob continued operating the logging camp into his 70s, refusing retirement, moving through the Pennsylvania forests with the same careful silence he had learned as a child and refined in France. Workers at the camp noticed he never spoke about the old days, never told stories about the war the way other veterans did. Some assumed he had seen nothing significant, others sensed that he had seen too much. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, a local newspaper ran a feature about area veterans who had participated in the Normandy invasion and subsequent campaigns. Jacob's name appeared in a list of local men who had served in Europe, identified only as Jacob Mercer, U.S. Army, France and Germany, 1944-1945. No mention was made of his specialized role. No photograph accompanied the listing. Jacob read the article once and placed it in a drawer with his Silver Star Commendation, two artifacts of a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else. Jacob Mercer died in 1998 at the age of 78, collapsing while inspecting timber in the same forest where he had learned to hunt as a child. His son found the blank journal among his belongings while settling the estate, along with the Silver Star and a single photograph of Jacob and Paul Dietrich standing in front of a ruined French church, both men young and still recognizable as the people they had been before the work changed them. His son placed the items in a box and stored them in an attic, where they remained undisturbed, evidence of a war that had ended on paper but continued in silence for those who had fought it in ways that language could not contain. The forests of Pennsylvania continued their cycles, deer moving through morning fog, hunters tracking them with rifles, the ancient rhythm of predator and prey. But Jacob Mercer's absence left a space that could not be filled, a reminder that some skills, once turned toward killing men, could never return to their original purpose. The war had taken a hunter who respected every kill and transformed him into a weapon of devastating efficiency. When the war ended, the weapon remained, but the hunter was gone, lost somewhere in the ruins of French towns and German villages where precision had been survival, and survival had required the erasure of everything that made killing sacred. The blank journal sits in an attic in Pennsylvania, its pages yellowed and untouched, a testimony to what Jacob Mercer witnessed and what he could never write. The war ended in 1945, but for Jacob it continued in silence until the day he collapsed in the forest, finally released from the weight of 39 lives, ended with precision and the knowledge that each shot had destroyed not just a target, but a piece of the man who pulled the trigger. Some transformations are irreversible. Some hunters never come home. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Jacob Mercer. We'll see you in the next video.